Ladies and gentlemen, our next speaker actually is coming all the way from Austin, Texas. Unlike some people. Where's Luke? Anyway, everyone, Vanessa Lee talking to us about browser testing. Give it up.
Hi, yes, I'm Vanessa Lee, and I'm going to say first, I am looking to start a mentorship program here in Austin, and the biggest hurdle has been finding space. So if you are here and running a business or working at a business and have space, please come and see me. So I'm also an Elixir developer at Interfolio, and also in addition to development, I love to watch, read, and listen to true crime. As a matter of fact, I just completed my first course in forensic genealogy. I like to solve puzzles, I like to put right a wrong, and also I was raised by World War II era grandparents who taught me that it's my responsibility to bear witness to history, politics, the suffering of others. And Texas has its own bloody and murderous history, and I don't just mean the Alamo. We can bear witness to one particular year in Austin's history to become better developers, because that year will teach us to test our software. So the year is 1884, and a series of murders is about to begin in Austin, Texas. But before that, the city was great. The Gilded Age had finally caught up with this little cow town. We had 17 businesses with telephones. We had enough money in the coffers to build a capitol, finally. And the University of Texas is open with 1 building, 8 professors, and 221 students. But on the night of December 30th, 1884, Molly Smith, a 25-year-old black servant woman, was brutally murdered. And over the course of a year, 6 more women would be killed. The residents of the city were terrified. The local paper was demanding justice, especially after the victims began to include white women. But at this time, there was no criminology or forensics. There wasn't even fingerprinting. Fingerprinting wouldn't be used for another 7 years. And not even the smartest man in town, William Sidney Porter, better known by his pen name O. Henry, could solve these murders. But he did name them. He called them the Servant Girl Annihilator Murders. And Austin's mayor, J.W. Robinson, at the time, knew he was going to need some help. So he sent a telegram to Chicago to the Pinkerton Agency. Now, at this time, the Pinkerton National Detective Agency was a really big deal. Alan Pinkerton had thwarted an assassination attempt on President-elect Abraham Lincoln, and then Lincoln hired Pinkerton agents as his security during the Civil War. But unbeknownst to poor Mayor Robertson, there were 2 Pinkerton agencies in Chicago. There was the real Pinkertons, and a less renowned Pinkerton and Company run by Matt Pinkerton, who was a former night watchman at the real Pinkerton agency, fired for incompetence. So the poor mayor's telegram ended up with the fake Pinkertons, who then showed up in Austin having never investigated a murder. So the mayor pretty quickly figured out his mistake, but didn't own up because he didn't want to hurt his political career. But they bungled the investigation, so everyone found out anyway. But can we blame poor Mayor Robertson? Because he didn't know. He didn't know there were 2 agencies. He didn't know to use the right name. So he had some unknown unknowns to deal with. And unknown unknowns are the prime reason to test our software. I personally have used browser automation testing to catch some really big unknown unknowns and to illuminate some blind spots. Now, one of the ways I justify my obsession with true crime is a concept called sympathetic magic. So, a shaman may have painted a scene of a successful hunt on a cave wall as a way of sympathetically magicking that success into the real world. So I worry about being murdered as a way of not being murdered. And I'm building a fortress of information to protect myself and my family. I'd like to say that Mayor Robertson should probably worried a little more about murder and less about his political career. but we can learn from his mistake. We can do our best to uncover our unknown unknowns by building a fortress of information with our tests, specifically acceptance tests. So the goal of acceptance tests is to mimic as closely as possible how a user would interact with our software. And it's, so we could have like, you could have 100, we all have 100% coverage in our unit tests, right? But that's still not going to tell us if our software works for a user. So how do we choose? We have a lot of libraries to choose from. So I built a little passion project to just query the GitHub API and sort of really boil it down. If your language is Elixir, you show up, I use some search terms, and we see there's about 8 that come up if you search for browser tests. And there are 3 that are relatively mature. But once we start looking at stars and watchers and forks, the top 2 really stand out. And actually, they were maintained so much that they were updated the day before the conference, both of them. And they have an active user base with active issues. So let's take a look at those top 2 results, Hound and Wallaby. First, we're going to take a look at their similarities and differences. Then the pros and cons. We'll do some benchmark comparisons and then even talk about some non-Elixir alternatives. So looking at them side by side, they both integrate with XUnit. So alongside that 100% coverage of unit tests you all have, you can also have coverage with browser automation tests. And the biggest difference between the 2 comes down to Hound is explicit, Wallaby is implicit. And that seems to come from, Chris Keithley says that Wallaby came from Capybara. I don't come from a Ruby background, so that may speak to you in a way that it does not speak to me, but they do implicitly do all the XPath work for you behind the scenes. So to continue the theme of explicit, with Hound you explicitly assign a WebDriver and explicitly start that WebDriver. Wallaby used to start it for you and assign it for you when it was really married to Phantom.js, but Phantom.js is dead. And the maintainers, yeah, I should have brought my old laptop with the bubbled battery that I swear is because of Phantom.js. But the maintainers of Wallaby have done a great job. They have experimental support for Chrome and Selenium, and I would say that adjective of experimental is gonna go away pretty soon because I've been using them. They're solid. So you do have to explicitly assign the WebDriver in both Hound and Wallaby, but Wallaby will start it for you. They both run headless or non-headless. Hound, you explicitly can tell them to, or tell each session, because you're starting the sessions anyway, to run as headless or non-headless, or start it in the config. With Wallaby, you start it in the config, or assign it in the config. You can interact with hidden elements with Hound, not with Wallaby. It has to be visible for you to interact with it. You can run JavaScript-heavy apps with both, asynchronous and concurrent tests with both, and screenshots. It's nice with Wallaby, you can assign, upon failure, to take a screenshot in the config. So some pros. The maintainers are doing a great job with Wallaby. I love the experimental support for the other browsers and the other WebDrivers, excuse me, and select option. Okay, so this one is a pro for me because I started with Hound and then went to Wallaby, and Wallaby has a helper for selecting an option from a select list. Hound does not. It's very pipeable, it's pretty, and the data3 helper is nice to avoid brittle code. So you can check to see if the data attribute is available anywhere in the DOM, which if you've ever worked with Ember.js is kind of nice because you don't get your IDs. Most operations do block until the query is valid or until the test time's out, but there is a con we'll see on the next slide. Hound already has support, and it has for a long time, for the Selenium and Chrome driver. It has this nice helper select element where it will, if it doesn't find the element, it will respond with a tuple instead of raising, which is nice. The implicit syntax works really well for me. That's definitely a personal thing. And it's highly configurable. The cons. So because of that retry helper, sometimes it will never halt. until XUnit kills it. I have seen some folks on Stack Overflow who have reported problems with Wallaby and LiveView. I haven't attempted it myself yet, so I'm not sure. The syntax, to me, isn't as intuitive as Hound. Some cons with Hound, so much regex. So if you are, you can really appreciate the implicit nature of Wallaby after you work with Hound for a while. You do so this is, to get an item from a select list with Hound, you don't have a helper like a select where or select in. You have to use, you have to execute a JavaScript, a little piece of JavaScript. It's not a big deal, you get it, it's just not intuitive. And some folks on Stack Overflow report problems with asynchronous tests with Hound. I've not had any problems, but some people definitely had. So we'll take a look at these in action, and we're just going to interact with a simple credit card form. And first, we're going to take a look at, does the page load correctly and have the page title we expect it to have? So you can see the syntax is pretty similar. And then if we do something more complicated, here we're navigating to the page and actually putting inputs into the form with some valid data. And here's where Wallaby really stands out with how pipeable it is. And you're just handing that session down to each line. And we're going to submit and expect to get a success. So first we'll take a look at the landing page. It goes really quick, don't blink. And then I looped this one so that you could have a better chance of seeing it. So we'll go through it a couple times. And it worked. So let's look at some benchmarks. So I used Benchy to see what sort of differences we could find in these two libraries. This particular test was doing exactly what we were doing with filling out the form fields, but it's changing one field in particular with stream data to something random that my business logic tells me is going to, or should succeed or should fail, and making sure that success or failure happens. And when we look at these, so this, you can see this sample size is relatively small, but what's valuable is these trends are going to carry out as we look at some bigger sample sets. Overall, Hound is faster, but not a lot faster. Just when we look under the microscope, Hound is faster, and Wallaby takes up more energy, or sorry, more memory. But that's probably because it's doing all of that work for us. So it's doing all of the XPath work for us. And so if we look at something with a larger sample size, here we're looking at different data types. I just wanted to see if different data types would reveal anything different. I see the same trend. All of the data types perform faster with Hound, a little slower with Wallaby. And there is an interesting box plot on strings in Hound. Lots of deviation going on there. I did use the big list of naughty strings, so I think some of them threw Hound a little bit. And here you can really see the memory differences, pretty consistent no matter what data type. And then I took a look at the different helpers. So these were the common helpers that each library mentions in its README, something that's going to be used by most people, although I did also add the selects in there because I wanted to see if there was any difference, right? So I didn't like having to use that JavaScript and then the helper, but I didn't see what I expected. The select in Wallaby is actually the most expensive. So these differences aren't huge, right? These benchmarks, it's really a matter of preference. Which one do you like? Is it a matter of syntax? Does your team come from a Ruby background? Maybe Capybara is going to be so familiar it's easy to write. Maybe I've turned you off to either of them and you never want to use them. And there are options. You could use a paid service. You could use a Selenium framework. If you have money and time, you could do a Selenium grid, or maybe you could do Selenium and Docker and make your own grid with all of these wonderful containers. But I thought we would take a look at Cypress. So Cypress it does not integrate with XUnit, but it is really simple to integrate with an Elixir project. So I can open the dashboard. You can also just run them, but the dashboard makes for a better presentation. So Cypress is written in JavaScript. Okay, this is what I was worried about. Let me just, there we go. So really easy syntax. It's written in JavaScript. This little dashboard will allow me to change my browser so I can run it in Electron or Chrome or whatever I have locally. Let's run this in Chrome. And then I can run all of my specs. We're going to look at a success and a failure. Oh, you're not going to look at a success and a failure, but I am. Hold on. Well, let me do it again. Let's see. Let's look at the one that fails. So what's nice about Cypress is it does have the little all-in-one printout so you can see that your tests are behaving as they should. So I have either, like I said, turned you off to these all together, or you see that you have a ton of options and that there's really no excuse not to do browser testing. Or you could use your own sympathetic magic and make a voodoo doll of your deployment manager or your QA manager. But I believe we have to worry, and we have to expect failure and plan for the worst. As Chris Keithley, the creator of Wallaby, said at his Gig City Elixir talk last year, failure is always an option. So no one expects the servant girl annihilator, and especially not the poor folks in Austin in 1884 who didn't even have the concept of a serial killer. We definitely shouldn't follow the lead of Austin's mayor. Ignoring the problem won't solve it, and it definitely won't keep it from happening again. When we fail, there's an opportunity to learn. There's an opportunity to illuminate dark spaces. And speaking of illuminating dark spaces, come and see me later and I'll tell you about the illumination that came to save Austin 10 years after the murders and became an icon of the city. So thank you. You can go home and write some of your own integration tests, and until then, be safe out there.